So there's this World Health Organization worker who's in a village, and this little black boy looks up at her and says, "What you doing?" And she says, "I'm counting AIDS cases in your village." He looks at her and he says, "Now when you say AIDS, do you mean HIV or full blown?"
Welcome to today's episode, where we are diving into the topic of AIDS, a subject that has shaped public health, medicine, and global policy for over 4 decades. Since it was first identified in the early 1980s, AIDS, which stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, has been officially understood as a condition caused by Human Immunodeficiency Virus, or HIV. According to the mainstream narrative, HIV attacks the body's immune system, weakening it and leading to AIDS if left untreated. This understanding has led to widespread awareness campaigns, preventative measures, and the development of antiretroviral drugs aimed at managing the virus. But as with many public health issues, there is more to the story and much more to discuss. Today, we'll explore the history of impact of AIDS and HIV, and we'll hear from Patrick on perspectives that challenge the conventional narrative.
Good to be here again, Holly. Always a pleasure to talk about something that I feel is so important and continues to be very important, just like it has for the last 40 years.
So what's the main thing people tell you when they hear you are working on alternative explanations about AIDS?
Yeah, well, there's actually two things. And you hear this also from kind of the standard alternative health community as well. And they start talking about there being a cure, or they heard that this hospital over here was curing people with AIDS, or there's this or that cure, and it's all been hushed up. But then they also talk about AIDS being created in a lab, either intentional or as a lab leak hypothesis. And this is very interesting because these two observations, is there a cure for AIDS, and then also if it was created in a lab, it allows these people to maintain a faith in the testing, because they're still saying there's something there. It seems like it's too much for them to question the legitimacy of the testing, but that's what I do.
Let's back up. What's AIDS? How did it get started? How do you get it?
Yeah, well, there amongst those that advocate for the official account, there's different theories about how it gets started. Everything from monkeys in Africa. Some people say that they brought the monkeys over to the United States as part of medical experiments. During the time of the polio vaccine, we brought tens of thousands of monkeys from Africa over to the United States for medical research. In terms of how you get it, it's said that you get it from participating in risk behavior. And that could be using drugs intravenously, like shooting it in the veins. Could be from homosexual behavior or promiscuous behavior, blood transfusions. So they say that if you're part of this risk group, also as a risk group, you'd include people with underlying health problems. These are also the people that tend to get tested: promiscuous men, gays, drug users, and people who already have underlying health problems.
At first it was called GRIDS, wasn't it?
Yeah, GRID stands for Gay-Related Immune Disorder, and it was called that before it was called AIDS. At the time, there was enormous pressure on the Reagan administration, the United States, to fund this. And of course, throughout the 70s, billions and billions of dollars have been spent on these laboratories trying to find a viral cause for cancer. And it was a failure. They couldn't find a viral cause for cancer. And these labs and the Center for Disease Control was actually facing closure. And so they needed a new epidemic to justify the funds. And it appeared in clusters of gay men in the big cities of the United States. And it was, at first, it was only two diseases. It was Kaposi sarcoma, skin cancer, and PCP pneumonia. Now AIDS is 30 plus diseases in the presence of HIV, but at the time it was only these two. They keep expanding the definition. It's interesting though, because it's not a new disease. That's something that a lot of people don't realize. AIDS isn't a new disease. It's a collection of diseases, but
Okay.
have been around for a long time.
But all of us have seen the images of Queens from and Freddie Mercury dying of AIDS. And there were other celebrities that helped cement the disease in the public mind. Tell us about the words AIDS Day.
Yeah, well, on December 1988, they celebrated for the first time the International Day of AIDS, using the strategy that a hypothesis periodically repeated was to convert it into a social reality. And it's interesting, in the 80s and 90s, the question about the cause of AIDS was a much more open question. And it was a question that was featured in mainstream magazines and television, whereas now with the passing of time, it's entered into the public consciousness as a myth, and it's very hard to question it. Now, one of the things that people are often surprised about is that so many highly qualified scientists do question it. I mean, there's a censorship around this issue that is unlike anything I've ever seen. For example, there were 12 highly esteemed biomedical scientists, Nobel Prize winners, and they wrote 4 sentences, and they tried to get it published and then signed this letter in, the Lancet, the New English Journal of Medicine, various medical magazines, and they couldn't even get their 4 sentences published. And all they said, they were called the Group for the Reappraisal of AIDS, and all they said was the following: it is widely believed by the general public that a retrovirus called HIV causes a group of diseases called AIDS. Many biomedical scientists now question this hypothesis. We propose a thorough reappraisal of the existing evidence for and against this hypothesis be conducted by a suitable independent group. We further propose that critical epidemiological studies be devised and undertaken. Hardly controversial, that's just 4 sentences, but they couldn't even get that published in the medical journals. But in fact, it's not just 12 medical scientists that are saying this. There's over 3,000 biomedical scientists, doctors, highly qualified professionals that are calling for a reappraisal of the evidence that HIV causes AIDS.
I've heard you talk a lot about AIDS, and while I believe in the official account, I share your concern about the truthfulness of the testing. Mm-hmm. Once we open the door to the idea that symptom-free person could be a false positive, then it raises the thorny question of a person with symptoms being the possibility of a false test result. This will have dramatic implications on treatment protocols, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would. So it's easy to see that some things could be a false positive, like 3 or 4-year-old girls that show up positive, housewives and old women. And it's a little harder to say that something's a false positive when people already have the symptoms. But if you recognize, as you say, that there are false positives with symptom-free people or asymptomatic people, then it does raise the question, how do we know what a false positive is in the first place? Because not even the World Health Organization has offered a standardized way to interpret the tests. In fact, a positive test in Argentina becomes a negative test in Brazil. They've never been standardized against any kind of criteria. And of course, if somebody who has pneumonia and doesn't have a positive HIV test, they get one treatment, and the person who has pneumonia and who has a positive HIV test, they get another treatment, sometimes a double treatment. So it's, it has dramatic implications for treatment. And
tell us about the Bangui definition of AIDS in Africa. Am I pronouncing the word correct?
Bangui, yeah.
Bangui, yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is interesting. This was in the late 80s. They developed what was called the World Health Organization developed a Bangui definition, and it declared you could be declared an AIDS patient in Africa on the basis of symptoms alone, which is, even though I'm critical of the testing, at least the testing offers a barrier against just saying that everybody has AIDS. But with the 30 plus diseases that now are included as AIDS-defining diseases, including the common cold, they actually teach medical students now that the first signs of an HIV infection could be flu-like symptoms or even common cold-like symptoms. As a Bangui definition, you don't need an HIV test in order to test positive, and I mean in order to be considered positive. And this has had the effect of greatly increasing AIDS statistics in Africa. And these are not new diseases in Africa: tuberculosis, anemia, malnutrition. These are all old African diseases. But when you give antiviral drugs to Africans that are already suffering from malnourishment and disease, they don't last very long. Now, with the passing of time, when AIDS cases should have been getting less and less, what they've done is they've expanded the definition so it appears that there's more and more AIDS. Exactly the opposite of what happened in the polio. At the end of the 50s, they restricted the definition of polio so that there were less polio cases, so they could claim their medicine worked. It's exactly the opposite with AIDS. So there's ways to juggle with statistics. Now in South Africa, they actually do a lot of HIV testing, and more women than men show up positive, which is very interesting because a completely different disease in Africa, because in United States and Europe, it's mostly men that show up HIV positive, but it's also mostly men that get tested because of the perception of being part of a risk group. But although they do test pregnant women a lot, and we'll talk about that later, but it's been asked, why do more women test positive in South Africa? But there's a good reason. There's so many things that can cause a positive HIV test, including birth control. And the more foreign substances you inject into your system, the more antibodies you're going to have. And the HIV test, they detect antibodies. That's very crucial. The HIV tests do not detect the virus itself. They detect antibodies, which aren't even specific to HIV. And they can't compare it against a gold standard because HIV has never been isolated and characterized.
Why isn't there an AIDS vaccine?
Well, what vaccines do, supposedly, is what we're told, is they give you antibodies. So, for example, you take a measles vaccine, your body produces antibodies against measles. An antibody is a little molecule inside your body that's a copy of the disease, and that means that your body has fought it, you're immune, you can't get that disease. It would be difficult to make an HIV vaccine because if it gave you that kind of immunity, you would have antibodies against HIV. What do the HIV tests detect? It detects antibodies against HIV. So wouldn't you be immune? Now they say, well, you have viral immunity, but then there's a latency period, and sometime down the road, it turns and starts attacking your system. Is completely theoretical, but I suspect the reason there isn't an AIDS vaccine is because these people that test positive, they already have immunity, and it's that very immunity that's showing up on the tests.
You said this is more than just a medical issue. It's a constitutional one. What do you mean by that?
Well, yeah, going back to pregnant women. So they test pregnant women, and then if a woman tests positive, there's a whole set of protocols that kick in, including the state insisting that she has a cesarean section. There's all sorts of protocols related to not breastfeeding, all sort of protocols related to the medicines she has to take. And women who have not gone along with some or any of these protocols have actually gone to jail. They've had their babies taken away from them. A lot of the times when people have a positive test, they start researching it and then they realize it's all phony baloney. But it's also a constitutional issue because there are people in jail just for having sex while being HIV positive. That's in a lot of countries, that's not only considered attempted murder, but it's also considered rape. And there have been lots of cases. So it concerns us all because it's the same Constitution. If it's happening over there to somebody, it's still the same as my Constitution that's being violated. So a lot of people, they get into this issue because they have a positive test or because something makes it personal for them. I don't understand that, like, let's ignore it because as a constitutional issue, it affects all of us.
How can a belief system make someone sick enough to die?
Well, in the case of like these homosexuals, they feel guilty about their behavior, and so then they believe that they have brought this upon themselves. There's a lot of videos on YouTube of people explaining like the process they go through, and they believe that they've engaged in some sort of risk behavior, and I call them chronogrammists, because they believe that these things happen according to a chronogram. Like first they're part of a risk group, they engage in risk behavior, then they have a positive test, then they start on antiviral drugs, and then in about 10 years they die. They believe that these things have to happen according to a chronogram, and it's that belief system that ultimately does them in. But there's a little more than that, because it's a belief system that causes them to take the chemotherapy drugs, which bring all the symptoms of immune deficiency, because these drugs were developed originally as chemotherapy to be used with cancer patients. And they bring all the same side effects, hair loss, muscular degeneration, anemia, nausea, vomit. It's a severe price to pay for questionable benefits.
Tell us the story of the Peruvian couple where the man wrote to you.
Okay, yeah, in my AIDS Foundation in Spanish, yeah. He told me that, well, actually, he was Italian and his wife was Peruvian. They were living in Peru, and she was just about to have her second child. She fell into this net of testing, because in many countries, they automatically test pregnant women. And she came up with a positive test. And,
HIV.
Yeah.
Positive.
And actually, he did too. But then he went to the internet. He found Dr. Peter Duesberg's book, Inventing the AIDS Virus. He read it in 1 week, and he just started studying and very quickly became expert. Whereas the wife started taking the medicine in Peru. It was ACT, and she didn't last long. She died she gave birth to the baby and died after about 6 months. She followed all the instructions of the doctors, very quickly died. Now he's alive to tell about this. But it's not just him that's written to me. So many people have written to me with these stories, like Dr. Manuel Garrido, who has the organization in Spain, Overcoming AIDS. He was tested at the end of the 80s. He was a doctor. He thought he was going to die, but he never took the antiretroviral drugs. Then later he found out, well, there's some debate about this, and now he's the main expert in Spain, and a political activist with that organization. But all the people that I know who were diagnosed in the late 80s and who are still alive today are the ones who haven't taken the antiretroviral drugs. Now, we don't hear about them. Their stories aren't on the internet. I mean, they're hidden. They're not. The algorithms make it so that we don't easily get linked to their stories, but it's pretty amazing. Now, a lot of these people, they'll go back and have a second test and they'll find that they are HIV negative. And this is also one of the problems with the testing, that how can you be HIV positive on Monday, HIV negative on Tuesday, and indeterminate on other days? So it's, but the testing is, is complete bogus.
What role have the AIDS activism organizations played in all this?
Oh, well, it's huge. There's a whole industry, and these organizations in Africa, they have a lot of money, and also the gay organizations. So, and they work very closely with the pharmaceutical companies. So if there's an AIDS conference where there's a speaker that has an alternative view, they can bus in people, they can cause protests. And because there's so much money involved, they're very much able to appear that they're part of the grassroots.
What about the testing?
Well, yeah, that's the heart of this whole thing is the testing. Now, the two discoverers of AIDS that are accredited for discovering AIDS, one of them was a Frenchman by the name of Luc Montagnier, and another one was Robert Gallo, an American one. And they disagreed about who discovered HIV, but as there was a lawsuit because both of them had developed testing, and they made a lot of money on the testing, but they both claimed that they had discovered HIV, so the other one shouldn't get money for the testing. And finally, the government of France and the government of the United States stepped in and said, okay, no, you share the royalties for the testing. But when Robert Gallo, the American guy, when he first developed the HIV test, the Western blot, as it's called, 30% of the American population tested positive. And the pharmaceutical companies sent the test back and said, no, we can't have this, 30%. So he tweaked it. And so now about 3% of the population test positive. We don't know because they don't do random testing. It's said that there's about 40 million people living with HIV worldwide. And it appears that it's with risk groups, but it's only risk groups for the most part that get tested. I think that if we truly did random testing, even on children and people that we think wouldn't be HIV candidates, we see that number get up to like 200 million, maybe even more, which would certainly challenge our ideas about that transmissibility. And they've done testing. There's a very good test that was done with a university in Venezuela where they tested tribes in the Amazon, which had never had contact outside the tribes. They never used drugs, but they were 13% HIV positive.
I want to know how you got interested in HIV and AIDS. Why is that so important to you?
Well, it was 2011. I was in South America. I was in Colombia, and I had a lot of time on my hands. I wasn't working, and I had a lot of time to study. And the internet was a lot more open in those days. And I realized, wow, I can get to know these different themes very quickly if I just say, okay, this week I'm studying one thing, next week I'm studying another thing. So I woke up one Monday and I said, okay, this week I'm studying AIDS. And I came at it at first from the point of view of thinking it was created in a lab. But then I very quickly discovered the work of Dr. Peter Duesberg, the Perth Group, John Lawrenson, what are known as these AIDS dissidents. And I realized that, okay, the real experts that are making the convincing arguments, they're saying there's nothing here. It's just an epidemic of a new test. Now, after 2020, I realized they're using the same pattern, the epidemic of a new test and the toxic treatment. they're using the same pattern to take away our rights. And it looked like 40 years ago, they did a dress rehearsal and a warm up for what was to come later. So I've seen that it doesn't go away. It just has a new name. You know, the face mask is like the reincarnation of the condom. But the ideology is the same. The fear is the same. The fear of the asymptomatic carrier, and the constitutional issues are the same. So there's a lot of reasons why, but it's an emotional issue. It's hard to get people interested in it, and even doctors who have the training to be able to understand, you think they'd be the most interested, but a lot of the times they're the most threatened by it.